So the next little part then is the nitrogen cycle. So let's get started. Now the nitrogen cycle then is also another nutrient cycle, as the name suggests. This time we're looking at the flow of nitrogen containing compounds. Now, before we get started on this, there are several different nitrogen containing compounds. One of the main one is amino acids. Amino acids can then be built up into proteins, which also contain nitrogen. And likewise, proteins can be broken down into amino acids. So say for example, we've got some grass. The sheep can eat the grass, and what can happen is any proteins that were in the grass get eaten, digested, and then broken down into amino acids, and then the sheep can use these amino acids to make its own proteins, and that's how it grows more muscles. Other nitrogen containing compounds that we've got might be things like nitrates, which is basically ions that plants use to make proteins. Now, plants can only use nitrogen in the form of nitrates. So most of the nitrogen cycle, when you're thinking about plants, involves them converting something into nitrates so that they're able to use it. We also have ammonia, which contains nitrogen. So these are the four main nitrogen containing compounds involved in the nitrogen cycle: amino acids, proteins, nitrates, and ammonia. Now let's start off with a typical nitrogen cycle. So if we start off here, nitrogen compounds in the plants. Now, the nitrogen compounds found in plants might be amino acids or proteins. What happens is the animals feed on them, and in this process, whatever the compounds were in plants, the animals will eat them, digest them, and make their own nitrogen compounds. So this time, the nitrogen compounds found in animals are going to be amino acids and proteins as well. Now, like in the carbon cycle, the plants can die and decay, and the animals can die, decay, and produce waste. So we get nitrogen compounds in dead organic matter. Now again, that's amino acids and proteins. The dead organic matter gets broken down by decomposers in the process of decomposition, and we get ammonia. The ammonia is then converted into nitrates in the process of nitrification. Now we'll talk about what that is in a little bit later on. So ammonia is converted into nitrates in nitrification. And then the nitrates are absorbed by the plants in the process of active uptake. There's two other little processes that can take place here. There's nitrogen gas in the air. Remember, around 78% of the air is made up of nitrogen. So this nitrogen can get converted into nitrates, which the plants can then absorb and produce their own nitrogen compounds in plants. And that is carried out by nitrogen fixing bacteria in the process of nitrogen fixing. The final process then is denitrification. Denitrification takes place when nitrates are converted into nitrogen gas in the air. Now, we'll look at each one in a bit more detail here, but that is a typical nitrogen cycle. Now, let's go through each step and just pick it apart in a little bit more detail. So we start with a plant. Let's say a tree. So this is nitrogen compounds in plants. And the main ones are going to be amino acids and proteins. Those plants then get eaten in the process of feeding by animals. And here's a nice little sheep again. Hi guys. There's his little ears, there's his little tail. And we get nitrogen compounds in animals. Now, those nitrogen compounds, again, are going to be amino acids, proteins. Now, what can happen next is, and this happens in both plants and animals, the plants can die and decay, and the animals can also die, decay, and they can also produce waste. So, when we're talking about waste here, we're talking about feces and urine, which contains urea, and that's the nitrogen containing compound in urine. So when plants die and when animals die and produce waste, it produces nitrogen compounds in dead organic matter. And the main ones in that, again, are going to be amino acids and proteins. So all very straightforward so far, all very similar to the carbon cycle. This is where it starts to deviate a little bit. Now, what we said was that all this dead stuff can't accumulate in an ecosystem because it's not good for the organisms that live there. So what has to happen is this dead matter has to get broken up, and it gets broken up in the process of decomposition. So all those nitrogen compounds in the dead organic matter get converted to ammonia in the process of decomposition. This ammonia then gets converted into another type of molecule, which is called nitrates. Now, nitrates are the only molecules that plants can actually use. So if the plants want to get nitrates, or if the plants want to use nitrogen, they have to get it in the form of nitrates. Now, the conversion of ammonia to nitrates is called nitrification. These nitrates are then absorbed by the plants in a process called active uptake. Now, we'll come back and we'll talk about active uptake in a minute. In fact, let's just do it now. So active uptake is moving substances from a low to a high concentration against concentration gradient, and it requires energy. Where does it get this energy from? From respiration. So that's active uptake. Now we'll come back and we will actually look at that in a bit more detail again. Okay, so this is where we are at the minute. We've got nitrates, which were produced from the ammonia. The nitrates get absorbed by active uptake and go into the plants. The plants then use the nitrates to make amino acids and proteins, and the cycle continues. Okay, now the two extra bits in this cycle are this. We can have nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. Now remember, 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen gas. It can actually be fixed by certain type of plants in their roots and those little things there which are called root nodules. So this nitrogen gas can actually be converted into nitrates in the process of nitrogen fixing or nitrogen fixation. Now, if we look at that in a bit more detail, nitrogen fixing, in this process, it converts nitrogen gas to nitrates. This only happens in the root nodules of legumes, which are things like peas, beans, and clover. Now, what's a root nodule? A root nodule is basically little balls on the roots which contain nitrogen fixing bacteria. And these nitrogen fixing bacteria are only found in the roots of legumes. So that's why farmers will sometimes make sure that they plant peas, beans or clovers in soil which is not very nutritious. So nitrogen gas gets converted into nitrates in root nodules of plants. Remember we said that plants need nitrates to produce their amino acids and proteins. So this is really useful because it means that nitrogen gas can be used to produce nitrates, but only if you have got legumes and nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now, once the nitrogen gas has been converted to the nitrates, the cycle can continue once again. Now, the final process that we've got that we need to talk about is this one. And this one is bad. This is denitrification. And it's carried out by denitrifying bacteria. This will only happen in waterlogged soils where there is no oxygen. So this is an anaerobic process. And it is bad for the environment because it removes nitrates from the soil and converts it to nitrogen gas. And that is the entire nitrogen cycle. Now there's still some extra wee bits of detail in each part, so let's have a look at each one. Now, one of the things that we need to know about is the nitrogen cycle and bacteria. So the main processes and bacteria involved are firstly nitrogen fixing, and that's carried out by nitrogen fixing bacteria, decomposition by decomposers, nitrification by nitrifying bacteria, and denitrification by denitrifying bacteria. Now, let's have a look at what each one converts. So nitrogen fixing bacteria carry out this process where they convert nitrogen gas into nitrates. Decomposition by decomposers converts proteins in dead organic matter into ammonia. Nitrification converts ammonia into, oh hello there, into nitrates, and denitrification converts nitrates to nitrogen gas. Now we've pretty much covered all of these steps. So the only thing that you could really do here is if you wanted to pause this and make little notes on this as we go along. And this just shows you the little root nodules. So remember, the root nodules contain nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they are found in the root nodules of legumes. And they convert nitrogen gas into nitrates. It's good for the plants because the plants can then use the nitrates to make their amino acids, which they can then use to make proteins, which is what they need to grow. Denitrification then, as we said, takes place in waterlogged soils where there's no oxygen, so it's anaerobic. This is a bad process because it removes nitrates from the soil and converts it to nitrogen gas. So to prevent this, farmers have to improve the drainage of their soil. So e.g. they could add sand to it, and they plough their fields to aerate the soil. This just shows you a bit more about active uptake. So remember, active uptake was when particles move from a low to high concentration. So in this is a root hair cell. Now this is not found in your head, this is found on the roots of plants. It helps plants absorb water and minerals because it provides them with a large surface area. So it's just a typical plant cell, except it has this root hair, which is just a little bit which sticks out. Now, generally speaking, in the soil, there's a low concentration of nitrates in the soil. So all of this area is the soil, and this is the plant cell. You can see here that the nitrate ions are in a low concentration in the soil, so we need to get them from an area of low concentration to high concentration. To do that, we need active uptake, which requires oxygen for respiration because this process needs energy. Two wee questions linked to this then. Describe the process of active transport. So the movement of molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration against a concentration gradient. Why does it require oxygen? Because the movement of molecules against the concentration requires energy. Energy is made in respiration, which requires oxygen, which again is why farmers are going to want to plough their field, because ploughing will aerate the soil and increase levels of oxygen.